veteran disrespected by woke protesters, and shows them what true courage means. The Memorial Day ceremony at Greenfield's Town Square was supposed to be a quiet commemoration, but Jim Carter felt unease creeping in as he approached the small podium adorned with a simple American flag. The crowd was sparse this year. A handful of veterans, local officials, and families gathered under a cloudless sky. As Jim adjusted his tie and glanced at the speech he had rehearsed for weeks, he caught sight of a small group of protesters standing at the edge of the square. Their signs were bold and accusatory. Stop glorifying war. Peace, not violence. And no heroes in war crimes. Jim's throat tightened, his resolve faltering. He reminded himself that his speech wasn't about justifying war, but honoring those who never came home. He pressed forward. The protesters grew louder as the ceremony began. A young woman in her early 20s, her face flushed with intensity, stepped forward. "Why do you celebrate killing?" she yelled, her voice slicing through the mayor's opening remarks. The mayor paused, visibly rattled. The protesters advanced. Jim locked eyes with the woman, her conviction palpable. When Jim's turn came, the microphone crackled as he approached. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Today, we gather not to glorify war, but to remember sacrifice. Sacrifice that secured the freedoms we often take for granted." A sudden movement to his left broke his focus. One of the protesters, a young man, yanked the ceremonial wreath from its stand and tossed it to the ground. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The young woman, clearly the leader, looked momentarily stunned before regaining her composure. "No more lies," she shouted, directing her anger squarely at Jim. Jim clenched his fists, his years of discipline keeping him from responding in kind. Instead, he bent down, picked up the wreath, and placed it back. He met her glare, his eyes weary but resolute. "I fought for your right to protest," he said simply, turning back to his speech. But the moment had soured. The ceremony ended early, the mayor muttering apologies to the veterans in attendance. Jim left quietly, his heart heavy, as whispers of the incident spread among the attendees. That night, alone in his modest home, Jim replayed the confrontation in his mind. His hand hovered over the phone, tempted to call Colonel Henry Rhodes, an old friend who had always offered him counsel. Instead, he sat in silence, staring at the folded flag that had once draped his late wife Linda's coffin. "What would you have done?" he whispered into the emptiness. Jim didn't know it yet, but the seeds of change had been planted. Across town, Emma Saunders, the young protest leader, was experiencing a rare moment of doubt. Emma Saunders sat cross-legged on her dorm room bed, surrounded by a chaotic mixture of protest signs, half-empty coffee cups, and notes scrawled in a frenzy. The faint hum of campus life seeped through the window, but Emma was lost in thought, staring at the faded photo of her grandfather that hung on her corkboard. He was in his dress blues, smiling proudly, long before the years of struggle etched deep lines into his face. She had told herself that the protest earlier that day was a victory, a necessary step in exposing the truth about war's ugly realities. But now, in the solitude of her room, the image of Jim Carter's face lingered in her mind. There was no anger in his expression, only a kind of quiet disappointment that unsettled her more than any shouting match ever could. Emma clenched her jaw, reminding herself why she'd started this fight. Her grandfather, a man she had adored as a child, had been consumed by the aftermath of his service. Nights filled with muffled cries and days drowned in whiskey had shattered their family. He had died alone in a veteran's home, estranged from the people he loved most. "You're doing this for him," she muttered under her breath, as if the words could steal her resolve. Her roommate, Chloe, burst into the room, her fiery energy instantly filling the space. "We made headlines," she announced, waving her phone. "Look at this. Veteran ceremony disrupted by bold activists. People are finally paying attention." Emma took the phone, scanning the article. The words "bold activists" did little to soothe the knot in her stomach. "It doesn't feel like a win," she admitted, setting the phone down. Chloe scoffed, dropping onto the bed beside her. "Come on, Emma. That guy, Jim, or whatever his name was, is just another cog in the machine. You saw the way people rallied around him. That's exactly why we need to keep pushing. People like him are symbols of everything wrong with this country's obsession with war. But he didn't fight back, Emma said softly. He could have yelled or called us out, but he didn't. That means something, doesn't it? Chloe frowned, clearly unimpressed. It means he knows how to play the victim. Don't let him get in your head. Ben, the third member of their trio, leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Or maybe he's not what we think he is, he offered, his tone measured. What if we're missing part of the story? Emma glanced at him, surprised. You're saying we were wrong to protest? I'm saying there's a difference between protesting the system and targeting a person, Ben replied. He didn't seem like the enemy to me. The tension in the room thickened as Chloe rolled her eyes. Ben, don't start with this both sides nonsense. You sound like one of them. Emma raised a hand, cutting off their bickering. Enough. We're not turning this into a debate team practice. She rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of leadership pressing down on her. Maybe we need to figure out how to focus on the message, not the man. Later that night, Emma sat by her desk, the photo of her grandfather now resting in her hands. She remembered a summer evening when she was 8, sitting on his lap as he told her stories of his time in the service. He had described his unit like a family, sharing tales of camaraderie that made her giggle. Do you miss them? She had asked, her small voice curious. Her grandfather's face had grown serious, his eyes distant. Every day, he had said, before forcing a smile and tickling her to change the subject. That moment stuck with her, even as the years that followed revealed the darker side of his story. She wondered now if there was a way to honor that complexity, the pride and the pain, without betraying her convictions. The next morning, Emma found herself scrolling through articles about the incident. Headlines varied, but one detail remained consistent. Jim Carter was a Vietnam War veteran. Curious, she clicked on a biography page about him. Purple Heart recipient, community volunteer, widower. The knot in her stomach tightened. What are you really fighting for, Emma? She whispered, her voice almost drowned out by the buzz of her phone. Chloe's text lit up the screen. Protest meeting at noon. Be there. Let's keep the pressure on. Emma stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. She didn't reply. Jim Carter stood in his modest kitchen, holding the neatly folded letter from Colonel Henry Rhodes. The words were written with the colonel's usual crispness. We need men like you to remind the younger generation what sacrifice truly means. Speak at Greenfield High this Friday. Jim set the letter down, his calloused hands trembling slightly. The memory of the protest was still fresh, and he couldn't shake the feeling that stepping into another public forum would invite more hostility. Yet, Henry's words tugged at him. His old friend believed in him, and deep down, Jim knew he owed it to those who hadn't come home. Linda, what would you do? He murmured, his gaze drifting to the photo of his late wife on the windowsill. She had always been his compass, her quiet strength guiding him through life's storms. As he prepared a simple breakfast, a different memory surged forward. The rescue mission in the dense jungles of Vietnam that haunted his dreams. His unit had been ambushed, pinned down by enemy fire. Amid the chaos, Jim had spotted a group of terrified villagers huddled in a nearby hut, caught in the crossfire. Against orders, he and 2 comrades had risked their lives to evacuate them. The screams, the smell of smoke, the weight of a child clinging to his neck, it all came rushing back. He had saved lives that day, but at a cost. 2 of his closest friends hadn't made it out. Their faces still visited him in the dark hours of the night. Shaking off the memory, Jim picked up the phone and dialed Henry's number. I'll do it, he said simply, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. Across town, Daniel Whitman, a senior at Greenfield High, was thrilled to hear that Mr. Carter had accepted the school's invitation. Daniel had witnessed the protest at the Memorial Day ceremony and had been struck by the dignity with which Jim had handled the confrontation. In the principal's office, Daniel made his case. Mr. Carter isn't just a veteran. He's a part of this community. The students need to hear his story. Principal Howard, a pragmatic man, raised an eyebrow. And you're certain this won't stir up controversy? Daniel nodded. We need to have these conversations, even if they're uncomfortable. That's how we learn. After a moment of hesitation, The principal agreed, and the assembly was scheduled. Emma Saunders sat in a campus coffee shop, scrolling through her phone when she saw a local news blurb. Vietnam veteran to speak at Greenfield High. Her stomach sank. It was Jim Carter. "Are you kidding me?" Chloe said, peering over Emma's shoulder. "They're giving him another platform after everything?" Ben, seated across the table, leaned forward. "Maybe that's not a bad thing." Chloe shot him a withering look. "Don't tell me you're going soft." "I'm saying it's an opportunity," Ben replied calmly. "If you're so sure he's wrong, why not listen to him and see for yourself?" Emma stayed silent, torn between her loyalty to Chloe's fiery stance and the nagging doubt Ben's words stirred within her. "Don't tell me you're considering it," Chloe pressed, her tone accusatory. "I'm considering understanding," Emma said firmly. "Maybe there's more to his story than we realize." Ben smiled, clearly relieved. Chloe, however, crossed her arms, muttering something about betrayal before storming off. That night, Jim sat at his desk, jotting down notes for his speech. He wanted to avoid glorifying war or justifying its brutality. Instead, he planned to focus on the lessons he had learned about resilience, sacrifice, and the bonds that had carried him through the darkest times. Meanwhile, Emma paced her dorm room, debating whether to attend the assembly. Part of her wanted to hear what Jim had to say, to understand the man behind the uniform. Another part feared what she might discover. "Do I want the truth?" she whispered, "or just to be right?" In their separate spaces, Jim and Emma prepared for the event, each unaware that their paths were about to cross again. Neither knew how profoundly the day would change them both. The Greenfield High Auditorium was electric with anticipation. Rows of students shifted in their seats, their whispers mixing with the occasional creak of chairs. Teachers stood at the back, arms crossed, while the principal paced near the stage, his apprehension evident. On the podium, the microphone stood ready, its metallic gleam catching the stage lights. Jim Carter sat off to the side, hands folded tightly in his lap. His suit jacket felt heavier than usual, the silence of his own thoughts almost deafening. He glanced at the packed room, wondering if the students would understand anything he had to say. "You've faced worse," he reminded himself, taking a deep breath. As Principal Howard introduced him, the murmurs died down. "Today, we're honored to hear from one of Greenfield's own, a veteran who has dedicated his life to service, not just in war, but in our community. Please welcome Mr. James Carter." The applause was polite, scattered. Jim rose and approached the podium, his steps deliberate, his chest tight. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and began. "Good morning. I'm not here to talk about medals or battles. I'm here to talk about people." His voice was steady, measured, as he scanned the crowd. Because war isn't just about soldiers. It's about families, communities, and the choices we make as a society. In the back of the auditorium, Emma stood with Chloe and Ben. Each held signs. Emma's read, "War creates victims, not heroes," though her grip on it felt uncertain. "Now's our chance," Chloe whispered. "The moment he starts spinning his narrative, we move." Emma's gaze flickered to the stage. Jim didn't look like the defiant figure she remembered from the ceremony. His face bore a weariness that struck her as deeply human. She glanced at Ben, who raised an eyebrow, silently asking her to wait. "Let's hear him out," Emma whispered. Chloe frowned, but didn't argue. Jim's voice filled the room as he recounted a pivotal moment from his service. "It was a rainy night in Vietnam," he began, his tone growing heavier. "Our mission was clear: hold the line and protect a nearby village. But war doesn't follow rules. It doesn't care about plans." He described the ambush, the chaos, the deafening sounds of gunfire. The room was silent, captivated. In the middle of it all, I saw her, a little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, clutching a broken doll. She was standing in the open, frozen in terror. Jim paused, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't know what made me run to her. Training instinct, maybe just sheer desperation. I scooped her up and carried her to safety, but not without a cost. 2 men in my unit didn't make it out that night. They were my brothers." He looked out at the audience, his eyes glistening. "I've spent every day since wondering if I did the right thing. I saved a life, but I lost 2 others. That's the reality of war. Choices you can never undo. Emma's heart clenched as she listened. Jim's words were raw, unvarnished. This wasn't the glorification of war she had expected. It was a portrait of a man grappling with impossible choices. Chloe, however, was unmoved. She nudged Emma. He's still selling it. Don't let him fool you. Without waiting for a response, she stepped forward, raising her sign high. Stop the lies! Chloe shouted, her voice cutting through the auditorium like a blade. Ben grabbed Emma's arm. Emma, wait! But it was too late. Chloe's chant grew louder, and a few other students joined in. The auditorium erupted into chaos, teachers trying to restore order as the protest gained momentum. Jim stepped back from the podium, visibly shaken. For a moment, he seemed lost, his hands gripping the edges of the lectern. Then he leaned into the microphone. If you think I fought for hate, he said, his voice firm despite the noise, then you've misunderstood everything. The words struck Emma like a physical blow. She locked eyes with Jim across the room, and for a moment, everything else faded. She saw not an enemy, but a man carrying a lifetime of pain, duty, and questions. Chloe, undeterred, escalated her chants, urging more students to join. Emma, torn, found herself unable to move. Her grip on the sign slackened until it slipped from her hands and fell to the floor. Emma, what are you doing? Chloe hissed, noticing her hesitation. I don't know, Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel Whitman stood from his seat near the front. Hey, show some respect, he yelled, glaring at the protesters. You don't have to agree with him, but he's earned the right to speak. A heated debate broke out among the students, voices rising in anger and confusion. The principal took the microphone, trying to restore order, but the moment had already unraveled. As the chaos subsided, Jim gathered his notes and stepped away from the podium. He gave one last look at the crowd, his eyes lingering on Emma, who stared back with a mix of guilt and something else. Admiration, perhaps. Chloe stormed out of the auditorium, dragging Emma and Ben with her. Outside, Emma pulled away, her chest heaving. What was that, Emma? Chloe demanded. You froze up. I listened, Emma snapped. And maybe you should have too. Chloe glared at her, shaking her head in disgust. You're losing your edge. She walked off, leaving Emma and Ben behind. Ben placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. You okay? I don't know, she admitted, her voice trembling. But I think I need to find out. Inside the auditorium, Jim stood alone, staring at the empty seats. For the first time in years, he felt something stirring, hope that maybe, just maybe, his words had reached someone. The morning after the assembly, Jim Carter sat at his kitchen table, staring at the mountain of mail that had arrived. Letters with neat cursive handwriting mingled with sharp, angry scrawls. Some envelopes were brightly colored with glittering stickers, thank you notes from students, and others were plain and ominously thick. The small desk lamp cast a warm glow over the clutter, but Jim couldn't bring himself to start reading. His speech had been shared on social media, and reactions had poured in from all sides. Supportive comments from veterans and families were buried under a barrage of attacks from those who saw his words as outdated and harmful. War criminal, one message had read. Another said, stop using your trauma to justify imperialism. Jim sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. He reached for a particular letter in a familiar, old-fashioned script. It was from Colonel Henry Rhodes. You did what most wouldn't dare, Jim, Henry wrote. You spoke your truth, and that's all anyone can ask. Remember, it's not about changing everyone's mind. It's about planting seeds. Jim folded the letter neatly and slipped it back into its envelope. He wasn't sure if his speech had planted seeds or just added fuel to the fire. The uncertainty gnawed at him. Emma Saunders sat cross-legged on her dorm bed, staring at her phone. Notifications blinked incessantly on the screen. Messages from Chloe, news articles about the protest, and campus group chats dissecting the assembly. She swiped them all away, her mind still replaying Jim's words. Chloe had made her opinion clear, calling Emma a traitor for freezing during the protest. But Emma wasn't sure anymore. Jim's story about saving the child, the tremor in his voice, and the weight in his eyes. They didn't fit the caricature Chloe had painted of him. Ben knocked lightly on her door before poking his head in. "Mind if I come in?" Emma shrugged. "Sure." Ben sat on the edge of the bed, his usually easygoing demeanor replaced with a quiet seriousness. "I get it, why you didn't chant with Chloe. Do you?" Emma asked, her voice brittle. "Yeah," Ben said, "because part of you realized he's not the enemy." Emma sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's not that simple, Ben. My whole life, I've seen the damage war leaves behind. My grandfather," she stopped herself, suddenly overwhelmed. "What about him?" Ben prompted gently. Emma hesitated before reaching under her bed and pulling out a battered leather journal. "This was his," she said, flipping through the yellowed pages. "I've avoided reading it for years, but maybe it's time." Later that night, Emma sat alone, the journal open on her lap. Her grandfather's handwriting was uneven, the ink smudged in places. She skimmed through entries detailing mundane moments, gardening, fixing the house, until she stumbled upon one dated 10 years after his return from the war. "Sometimes I dream of the faces, men I couldn't save, but I'm proud of what I did. Proud I stood by my brothers, even if it cost me everything." The words hit Emma like a punch to the gut. She had always seen her grandfather's service as a burden, but here was proof that it had also been a source of pride. He had carried the pain, yes, but also a sense of duty and accomplishment. Emma closed the journal, her eyes wet with unshed tears. For the first time, she wondered if her protests had been as one-dimensional as the glorification of war she opposed. Meanwhile, Daniel Whitman sat in the school library, a stack of books and old newspapers spread out before him. The assembly had left him inspired, but also curious. Who was Jim Carter, really? As he delved deeper, he uncovered details about Jim's rescue mission in Vietnam. It had earned him a commendation for bravery, but the event had been overshadowed by the loss of his comrades. Daniel was struck by the magnitude of the sacrifice. He drafted a post for the school's online forum. Jim Carter's story isn't about glorifying war, it's about understanding its cost. If we can't honor that, what does that say about us? Jim, meanwhile, couldn't shake the feeling that his words hadn't landed where they needed to. He found himself back at the memorial, the granite wall cool under his palm. "You always knew how to make sense of things, Linda," he said aloud, his voice carrying in the quiet. "I'm not sure I did the right thing. Maybe I made things worse." His phone buzzed, and he saw a message from Henry. "Meet me at the diner tomorrow. Let's talk." At the same time, Emma found herself drifting back to the assembly in her mind. Jim's closing words rang in her ears. "If you think I fought for hate, then you've misunderstood everything." She wanted to understand what he meant, to see if there was a bridge between his truth and hers. She opened her laptop and began drafting a message to Jim Carter. She didn't know what she wanted to say yet, but the act of writing felt like a step towards something she couldn't yet name. Both Jim and Emma were navigating unfamiliar terrain, their paths inching closer together. Each carried questions they couldn't yet answer, but felt compelled to confront. And though neither knew it, their journeys were no longer separate. They were threads in a story that was far from over. The community center was packed, the air thick with tension and curiosity. Rows of folding chairs lined the room, occupied by a mix of veterans, students, and locals. On the small stage, a moderator adjusted the microphone, preparing to introduce the evening's participants. Emma Saunders sat on one side of the table, her palms sweating. Across from her sat Jim Carter, calm but guarded, his military medals gleaming faintly under the fluorescent lights. The event had drawn more attention than either had anticipated, fueled by viral videos of the assembly. The moderator introduced the debate as a dialogue about the role of veterans in society, though both participants knew it was far more personal. Jim started with a story. He spoke of a village he had encountered during his service, describing how his unit worked with local families to rebuild their homes after a devastating attack. "It wasn't about winning or losing," he said, his voice steady. "It was about giving people a chance to rebuild their lives, even in the worst circumstances." Emma listened intently, surprised by the humanity in Jim's account. When it was her turn, she stood and addressed the audience with quiet determination. She told the story of her grandfather, focusing on how his struggles with PTSD had fractured their family. "War doesn't just affect those who fight it," she said, her voice tinged with pain. "It ripples through generations." The room was silent as Emma spoke, her words landing with emotional weight. Jim nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth in her statement. From the back row, Chloe broke the silence, shouting, "That's why we need to dismantle these systems. Stop glorifying soldiers." Her voice was sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. Emma turned toward her friend, the weight of the moment heavy on her shoulders. "Chloe," she said firmly, her voice commanding attention. "This isn't about shouting down the other side. It's about understanding." Chloe's face twisted in frustration, but she sat back down. The audience murmured, some impressed by Emma's composure, others skeptical. Jim resumed, addressing Chloe's outburst without hostility. "No one hates war more than those who've lived it," he said. "But hating the people caught in it? That's a different story." He paused, scanning the audience. "I'm not here to defend every decision made in a war room. I'm here to remind you that soldiers are human too." Emma felt a flicker of respect for Jim's restraint. She realized this wasn't a man looking for praise. He was looking for understanding. The debate escalated as audience members chimed in with questions. One asked Jim if he felt his service had been worth it. He hesitated, then answered with raw honesty. "There's no simple answer. I've lost friends, seen things I wouldn't wish on anyone. But I've also seen the best of humanity: compassion, resilience, sacrifice." Emma followed up, her tone softer than before. "And what about the families left to pick up the pieces? What about the children who grow up without parents?" Her voice cracked slightly, betraying her own pain. The turning point came when Daniel Whitman, sitting near the front, raised his hand. "How do we move forward?" he asked, his voice clear and earnest. "How do we stop blaming each other and start fixing things?" The question hung in the air, silencing the back and forth. Jim leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "By listening," he said simply, "by realizing we're not as different as we think." Emma nodded slowly, the words resonating with her. For the first time, she felt like they were working towards something constructive, rather than tearing each other down. The moderator seized the moment, guiding the discussion toward solutions. Audience members suggested community programs for veterans, mental health resources, and educational initiatives to bridge the gap between civilians and soldiers. Emma shared her idea of creating spaces where veterans and activists could share their stories without fear of judgment. Jim offered to participate, surprising even himself. As the event wound down, the atmosphere shifted from confrontational to collaborative. Jim and Emma exchanged a glance, tentative but hopeful. They had started on opposite sides, but the debate had revealed a shared goal: healing the wounds left by war. Chloe stormed out before the applause, but Emma didn't chase after her. She was beginning to realize that understanding others didn't mean betraying her beliefs. It meant strengthening them with empathy. Jim walked over to Emma as the crowd dispersed. "You've got guts," he said, offering his hand. Emma hesitated, then shook it. "And you've got heart," she replied. Their unlikely alliance was just beginning, but both felt the spark of something larger, a bridge being built over a chasm neither had thought could be crossed. Jim Carter sat in his living room, the fading light of dusk casting long shadows on the walls. A box of Linda's belongings lay open on the coffee table, untouched for years. Sorting through her keepsakes was both painful and cathartic. Among the photos, notes, and mementos, Jim's fingers brushed against an envelope yellowed with age. It was addressed to him, the handwriting unmistakably Linda's. The letter inside was brief, but powerful. Linda wrote about a rescue mission Jim had barely allowed himself to remember. She recounted how his actions had saved a family trapped in a war-torn village. The words painted a vivid picture of Jim carrying a wounded man, an older soldier with eyes full of gratitude, out of danger. Linda had never told him the details she'd learned from the survivors, but now, reading her words, it all came flooding back. Emma Saunders sat cross-legged on her bed, her grandfather's journal open before her. The leather-bound book smelled faintly of smoke and age. It had become a quiet ritual to read a few entries at a time, piecing together the life of a man she had both adored and resented. Tonight, she stumbled upon a photograph tucked between the pages. It showed a younger version of her grandfather standing beside a soldier. The soldier's face was unmistakable. It was Jim Carter. Emma's breath caught as questions tumbled through her mind. What had brought the two men together? And why had her grandfather kept this photo hidden? Across town, Daniel Whitman sat at his computer, eyes scanning a military database. He had been digging into Jim's service history for weeks, trying to understand the man who had inspired him. A report about a rescue mission caught his attention, the details matching a story Jim had briefly mentioned at the assembly. Daniel leaned closer as he read the names of those saved. One stood out, Frank Saunders. He froze, realizing the connection. Frank Saunders was Emma's grandfather. The implications hit him like a tidal wave. Jim stared at the letter in his hands, conflicted. He hadn't recognized Emma's grandfather during the debate, but now the man's face came into sharp focus. They had shared a moment of humanity in a world that seemed devoid of it. Jim felt the weight of the revelation. Should he tell Emma? Would it matter? Memories of the mission resurfaced. He had led his unit into the village under heavy fire, determined to evacuate the civilians. Frank Saunders had refused to leave until his family was safe, and Jim had respected his courage, even as it put them both in greater danger. Emma turned the photo over, noticing a scrawled note on the back. To the man who saved us all, thank you. F. Saunders. Her grandfather's gratitude was clear, but why had he never spoken about Jim? The discovery added another layer to her already conflicted emotions. She felt a mix of anger, curiosity, and admiration. Was it possible that the man she had protested against had been a hero to her family? The thought unsettled her, challenging everything she thought she knew. Daniel called Emma that night, his voice urgent. Emma, you need to hear this, he said, launching into what he had discovered. As he explained the connection between her grandfather and Jim, Emma's hands shook. She barely processed his words, her mind racing with questions. Are you sure? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Positive, Daniel replied. I even found a copy of the mission report. It's all there. Jim received an unexpected visitor the next morning. Daniel arrived with a printout of the mission report and an urgency in his demeanor. You need to talk to Emma, Daniel said, placing the papers on the table. Jim scanned the document, his heart pounding as he read the familiar names. The connection was undeniable. I don't know if she'll want to hear it, Jim admitted. She needs to, Daniel insisted. This could change everything. Emma couldn't stay in her apartment. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Clutching the photo, she headed to Jim's house. The address wasn't hard to find, and she stood at his doorstep, her heart racing. When Jim opened the door, their eyes met, and for a moment, neither spoke. Emma held up the photo, her voice trembling. We need to talk. Jim nodded, stepping aside to let her in. The room felt heavy with unspoken truths, both knowing the conversation ahead would change them forever. As they sat across from each other, the photo and the letter between them, the pieces of their shared history began to fall into place. Emma's anger softened as she listened to Jim's story, and Jim saw in Emma the echoes of the man he had once saved. Their connection, forged in the chaos of war, now offered a chance for understanding and healing. Emma stood at Jim's doorstep, her heart pounding like a drum. The picture of her grandfather, still in her hand, felt heavier than it should have. She hesitated, second-guessing the decision to come. When the door opened, Jim appeared, his expression a mixture of surprise and calm curiosity. Emma, he said, his voice steady but kind. I didn't expect to see you here. I found this, she began, holding up the photograph. Her voice wavered, but her resolve held. We need to talk? Jim gestured for Emma to come inside, his home modest but filled with signs of a life well lived. Framed photos of his late wife, plaques from his military service, and a worn American flag folded in a display case. Emma sat stiffly on the couch, the picture clutched in her hand. Jim placed 2 mugs of tea on the table, breaking the silence. I suppose this means you've discovered something about your grandfather, he said, taking a seat. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I found this in his journal. She placed the photo on the table, the image of her grandfather and Jim staring up at them both. Jim picked up the photo, a bittersweet smile playing on his lips. Frank Saunders, he said softly. I remember him well. Brave man. Too brave for his own good sometimes. Emma's brow furrowed. You saved him, didn't you? And his family? Jim sighed, leaning back. It was a team effort. But yes, we got them out of a bad situation. He paused, studying Emma's expression. He never told you, did he? No, Emma admitted, her voice trembling. He never talked about his service much. Just fragments. Jim reached for a letter on the table, the same one he discovered days earlier. I found this in my wife's things, he said, passing it to Emma. She wrote it after learning about that mission. I think she wanted me to understand the impact of what we did. Emma unfolded the letter, her hands shaking. As she read Linda's words describing the rescue, tears welled in her eyes. She could almost see the scene. Her grandfather, injured but alive, his family huddled together, saved by Jim's bravery. She placed the letter down carefully. I protested against you, she said, her voice breaking. I didn't know. I didn't understand. Jim shook his head gently. You couldn't have known, Emma, and you weren't entirely wrong to question things. War takes so much from everyone involved, but sometimes it's about saving lives in the middle of all that chaos. Emma stared at him, her convictions unraveling and reforming into something new. I thought protesting was the right thing to do, but maybe I've been going about it the wrong way. Jim leaned forward, his gaze steady. Your passion is admirable, Emma. You want to make the world better, and that's a noble cause. But sometimes it's about understanding the full story before taking a stand. The room fell silent, the weight of their shared history settling over them. Emma's mind raced, grappling with the contradictions. She'd spent so much time fighting against the very ideals her grandfather had honored in silence. I want to do better, she said finally, her voice resolute. I want to fight for peace, not division. Jim smiled faintly. That's a start. It's what your grandfather would have wanted. They talked for hours, delving into the nuances of service, sacrifice, and activism. Jim shared more stories of his time in the military, emphasizing the humanity he'd witnessed even in the darkest moments. Emma listened intently, occasionally sharing her own experiences as an activist. She spoke of the pain her grandfather's struggles had caused her family and how it had fueled her anger. Jim's empathy surprised her, his understanding helping her untangle her emotions. As the evening wore on, their conversation shifted toward solutions. What if we work together? Emma suggested hesitantly. To create something that bridges the gap? A space where veterans and activists can share their stories. Jim considered her words, nodding slowly. That could work. If we approach it with honesty and respect, it might make a real difference. Emma's face lit up for the first time that night. Maybe we can show people that understanding each other doesn't mean compromising our values. Jim chuckled. You sound like your grandfather. He was always looking for ways to bring people together. When Emma finally left, the photo and letter stayed with her, tucked safely in her bag. Standing on Jim's porch, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't known before. Jim watched her go, a quiet pride settling in his chest. The divide between them had begun to heal, and with it, the possibility of a better path forward. For the first time in years, he felt hope, not just for himself, but for the future they might help shape together. The community hall was buzzing with anticipation as attendees filled every seat. Veterans sat beside students, activists alongside military families, all drawn by the promise of a dialogue that bridged generations. At the front of the room, Jim adjusted his tie, a mix of nerves and resolve flickering across his face. Beside him, Emma smoothed her notes, her expression a blend of focus and hope. The event, titled Bridging the Divide, Stories of Sacrifice and Understanding, was their brainchild, a collaboration born of pain and healing. It was a chance to reframe the narrative that had once divided them, and the stakes felt monumental. Jim began the evening with a story from his service, one he had never shared before. It was a moment of quiet heroism, where his actions had saved not just lives but preserved a family's future. As he spoke, the audience hung on his words, the weight of his experience evident in every pause and inflection. Emma followed, her voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. She recounted her journey as an activist, from her initial anger and conviction to the revelations that had reshaped her perspective. She spoke of her grandfather, of Jim's role in saving him, and of the complexities of honoring their shared history. The room was silent for a moment after Emma finished, the emotional resonance palpable. Then, applause erupted, not out of politeness, but genuine appreciation for the courage it took for both speakers to share their truths. Daniel, sitting near the front, felt a swell of inspiration. Over the past weeks, his research into Jim's military history and his conversations with Emma had transformed him. When the floor opened for questions, he stood, his voice steady despite his nerves. "What can young people like me do," he asked, "to ensure we honor the past while building a better future?" Jim smiled at the question, his eyes shining with pride. "Start by listening," he said. "Everyone has a story worth hearing. And don't be afraid to ask the tough questions about war, peace, and everything in between. It's in the dialogue that change happens," Emma added. "And remember, advocacy isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about finding common ground, even when it feels impossible. That's where real progress begins." The audience murmured in agreement, the generational and ideological divides in the room seeming to shrink. As the event progressed, the ripple effect became evident. Veterans shared their experiences with students who had never known war. Activists exchanged ideas with military families, discovering unexpected commonalities. The room transformed into a space of mutual respect and understanding, the atmosphere electric with possibility. Among the crowd, Chloe sat quietly, watching Emma with a mixture of admiration and regret. She hadn't agreed with Emma's decision to shift their approach, but seeing the impact of this event made her question her own tactics. After the speeches concluded, Jim and Emma mingled with the crowd. People approached them with stories of their own, gratitude shining in their eyes. An elderly woman shared how her late husband, a veteran, had struggled with PTSD but found solace in community. A young activist spoke of feeling disillusioned until that night, when hope had been rekindled. Daniel lingered, waiting for a chance to speak with Jim and Emma together. When his moment came, he said, "I want to thank you both. You've shown me that courage isn't just about fighting, it's about understanding. I'm going to study advocacy to help bring people together like this." Emma felt a lump rise in her throat. "You've got what it takes, Daniel. Keep asking questions and never lose that passion." Jim placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "The world needs more young people like you. Remember, it's the small actions that create the biggest ripples." As Daniel walked away, Jim and Emma exchanged a glance, their mutual pride evident. The divide that had once seemed insurmountable now felt like a distant memory. The evening ended with a collective pledge to foster dialogue and understanding, to honor sacrifice while striving for peace, and to challenge assumptions with empathy. As the crowd dispersed, several attendees approached Jim and Emma, asking how they could replicate the event in their own communities. "It's not about grand gestures," Jim told one woman. "It's about starting the conversation one person at a time." Emma nodded, "And being willing to learn from each other. That's where real change begins." As they stood in the now empty hall, Jim and Emma reflected on the journey that had brought them there. "You know," Jim said, his tone light but sincere, "your grandfather would be proud of you." Emma smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "And he'd be proud of you, too." They turned toward the door, the night air cool and invigorating. The path ahead was uncertain, but they knew they'd walk it with purpose. "True courage," Jim said as they stepped outside, "isn't in fighting battles. It's in bridging divides." And in that moment, both felt they had finally found their peace.